Welcome to Keel's Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences Grand Challenge lecture. It's great to see so many and so many different people here and such a diversity of people, so welcome to everyone. Today we welcome Professor Kevin Andersson, Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester and in Uppsala in Sweden. Kevin holds a joint chair between the School of Mechanical Aerospace and Civil Engineering at the University of Manchester and the Centre for Environmental Development at Uppsala University. Kevin's just completed a 2-year Zenström Professor of Climate Change Leadership at Uppsala and previously held the roles of Deputy Director and Director of the Tyndall Centre of Climate Change. Kevin engages widely across the tiers of government on issues from shale gas through to aviation, shipping and the role of climate modelling and carbon budgets. His analysis previously contributed to farming, the UK's Climate Change Act and the development of national carbon budgets. This has led to his involvement in several key papers on the subject of carbon futures, including a seminal paper that was published in Science on the deployment of CO2 removal technology globally to deliver our collective commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement. This is a highly charged and critical area of research, and as Director of the Institute for Sustainable Futures, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Kevin this evening to present his lecture entitled, Can Meaningful Hope Spring from Revealing the Depth of Our Climate Failure? Thank you very much, Kevin. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. Can you all see the slides quite well from the back? Okay, can you all hear me clearly? Yeah. Right. Before I start, I'll say I have a very bad habit of talking faster and faster. So please feel free to tell me to slow down. I always have to ask in Sweden when I speak. I talk often to Swedish students, and I think they really struggle to keep up with my fast English. And also, if anything is really not clear as I'm going through, also please feel free to call out and just ask me to clarify, because if you don't understand it, that probably means I've not explained it well and someone else doesn't get it as well. So it's fine to do that. I'm going to go through over the next, I think it's 40 to 50 minutes, sort of like a whistle-stop tour of my interpretation of the climate change challenge that we're focusing on, that we're facing. And the focus will primarily be on the energy system, because I work mostly on energy, and I should say, wasn't mentioned before, but I used to design and build offshore oil platforms. So I've had a different background. I come from an engineering background, working on ships, and then later on designing and building platforms for the offshore industry in Scotland. I'm going to sort of take you through how I see the challenge from a science point of view, what the options might be in terms of technologies, and then also bring together really what I think are the key issues around some of the ethical and social science and humanities dimensions of responding to climate change. This will not be an uplifting talk, but it will get much better later on. To start off with, it's pretty depressing. And I have an active Twitter account for those people that use Twitter, but I only use it for work. I don't use it for anything else, just for work. So I'm going to start off by outlining the framing of the Paris Agreement, which hopefully you're all reasonably familiar with, the Paris Agreement on climate change. And it committed us, and if you look at the language in the agreement, and it's important to look at that, to take action, so that's a good thing. It's not just to talk about it, to actually take action. To hold the increasing global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade, compared with before we started burning fossil fuels, the Industrial Revolution, if you like, 1850-ish. And ideally aim for no more than 1.5. Now, that won't sound, 2 degrees centigrade on well, actually it's quite a warm day in Kiel today, but on a chilly day in Kiel, you think, well, does that really matter? That is a huge shift in the climate occurring almost overnight. The most we've seen in the last 10,000 years of sort of modern human time is only 1 degree difference. And we're talking about aiming, really, well, not aiming, we're likely to get to 2 degrees occurring in 100 years pretty much. So very, very quickly. And so ecosystems and social systems probably cannot respond to that rate of change. And it's probably one of the reasons why some of the poorer countries came together in Paris and argued for only having 1.5 degrees centigrade rise. But that is also a huge change in the climate to occur very rapidly. And unfortunately, I think we can't hold to 1.5, and I'll come back to that later, but it's good that we try. But we should also make our adjustments on the basis of the best science, and very importantly, on the basis of equity. Equity is embedded in all of the international agreements, and not one country takes it seriously, including the UK. The UK ignores equity, so does Sweden. There's lots of lip service about it. And I would say equity is, I'm going to try and show this later, equity is key between nations, but also within nations. So it's now, I would say now, equity is simply, if we don't respond to it in an equitable fashion, we will fail on climate change. And that's a conclusion from the maths. It can be from conclusion from the morals, but from the maths, it demonstrates that. And I'll show that later on. I focus mostly on mitigation, which is this fancy academic term for reducing our emissions. But impacts are also important, so I'm going to have a couple of slides on impacts as well. And when I focus on mitigation, as I say, I'm focusing on the energy system, recognizing that the food and the agricultural system are also an important part of the picture. About 20% of the warming or of the emissions are approximately related to the agricultural, to the food system. And we cannot eliminate all of those. We can perhaps halve them, probably about the best that we can achieve, but we cannot eliminate all of the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. But we have to eliminate them all from energy, all the carbon dioxide emissions. But looking at the impacts, let's start by recognizing the Paris Agreement is unjust. We can't, and it really had no choice but to be unjust. Yeah, the impacts of 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade are already being felt by people around the world, by how the recent storm events and flooding in Mozambique were exacerbated by climate change, not caused by, but made worse by, as they were in Haiyan in the Philippines or in Sandy in New York. So these sorts of extreme weather events that we're seeing are made worse by climate change. They're not being caused by climate change, but actually as we warm up the climate, we are likely start to, the climate change that we have caused will likely start to be one of the major factors in some of the extreme weather events. So these people elsewhere in the world are suffering today. We are already seeing some major impacts on ecosystems. And again, climate change is another tension, another exacerbating factor on all of the other pressures that we're putting on existing ecosystems. Children around the world are already suffering from climate change. We've seen in the latest IPCC report, when it talks about the impacts of climate change are first felt by women and children. So we can actually empirically see this happening. So many people are already suffering, many people are already dying. And it's going to get much worse as we get to 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade of warming. So it's not a positive position that we're actually in. We are going to be affecting the future of future generations of all species and all ecosystems. That's locked into the system. So we're trying to minimize the damage that we've already set about. And remember that we've known about this for a long time, and I'll come back to that later. This is not new information. This is just what we've known for 30 years. We've chosen to fail. So I'm now going to talk about the issue of mitigation in terms of reducing our emissions. And let's just start by outlining the scale of our failure. So I think I said the start of the talk is not very uplifting, but just how bad is our failure? And the UK claims to be a climate progressive nation, and I'll come back to that later. I think that's a misunderstanding of our position. But a lot of academics, co-opted academics in my view, say that repeatedly, but so do government officials and so forth. Here is the sort of thing that I used to build. This is the Clare Ridge oil platform, BP, along with some other companies. First oil, November 2018. Estimated production, 640 million barrels. That's about 250 million tons of carbon dioxide. Only went out a year ago, started a year ago. We knew about climate change a year ago. So why was this allowed? 250 million tons. Remember, many of us here will be pushing up the daisies when this thing is still producing carbon dioxide. Now, this is going to be run for 30 to 40 years. That's the plan. Here we have the Glengorm gas discovery, announced 2019, this year, just a few months ago. Discovery, biggest oil gas field in decades, raises industry's hopes. The SNP in Scotland and the Conservative government and no doubt almost all the other policymakers are saying, wonderful, this new resource for the UK, 100 million tons of carbon dioxide, going for another 30 or 40 years. East Yorkshire this summer, near Hull, biggest gas field discovered on shore, another 13 million tons of carbon dioxide. So we're planning all these things for our children and our grandchildren's future. This is one of our climate progressive countries. Then we've got this gentleman who thankfully is no longer in this position because he was a fairly incompetent transport minister. And he was supportive and drove the agenda on expanding Heathrow. But he was supported by most of the MPs in the House of Commons across the parties. So most of them actually voted to have the expansion of Heathrow, which will mean lots more carbon dioxide emissions. Now, I personally think it probably will never go ahead. But we shouldn't have been talking about it really, not when we're facing the climate change impacts that we are. And if you follow the Committee on Climate Change, those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Committee on Climate Change are a semi-independent body, it's a quango, set up to give advice to the government on what it should do on climate change. And it's advised also by a group of academics who, in my view, are really good academics, but have been really bad in the advice they've given, very political advice they've been giving rather than scientifically informed advice. If you follow the Committee on Climate Change's pathway for aviation, that one sector, the one sector of aviation is set to take up 40% of our total carbon budget, and I'll come back to what I mean by that later. That's the total amount of carbon dioxide that we're allowed to emit if we're going to meet our Paris commitment. That one sector. And bear in mind that 70% of all flights are taken by only 15% of the UK population. And in any one year, half of the UK population does not fly. It's hard for academics to ever realise that because they spend half their life on planes. But most people in the UK do not fly often at all. And that's true, of course, for most other parts of the world. So is the UK showing leadership? Here we have the report from the Committee on Climate Change. It's called the Net Zero Report. Has anyone here heard of this? Quite a few of you. Net zero, I always jokingly say, it's not really quite a joke, but what the net is Latin for pass the buck on to the next generation. So that's what this report is about how do we pass on the challenge to the next generation because we can't be bothered to make the change. This report notes how in 2017 emissions were 42% lower than 1990 and now 44% lower. But if you look at the whole emissions from the UK, I mean, that's all that the climate cares about. It doesn't care about dodgy accounting practices. It just looks at the amount of CO2 molecules. Include aviation and shipping, which were excluded from that previous quote. So every country excludes the emissions from aviation and shipping, yet they're trying to grow them. And look at our imports and exports. So I'm using a laptop here, an Apple laptop, made in China. We blame the Chinese for the coal-fired power they're using to make the aluminium for this, and then I use the laptop over here. So if we take account of our imports and exports as well, what we see is not a 44% reduction, but a 10% reduction. That's 0.4% every year. And the main people we can thank for that, the only time you'll ever thank them in your lives, are bankers. And that's because they collapsed the economy in 2007. So look at the emissions drop after the bankers collapsed our economy. They can do some good things, bankers. It's not solely that, but significantly after that. You can see that in trends of virtually all Western countries. You can see that in. But it also went along with our closing down of coal-fired power stations, but most of those were closed down because of their sulfur emissions, not because of the carbon dioxide emissions. There's a long-term plan from 20 years ago to close them down because of their sulfur emissions. So it's not through careful climate change policies we've even achieved this. It's mostly, there's a bit of that in there, but it's mostly through happenstance. So the UK is a good example, and this is no different if you go to Sweden or you go to France or Denmark. Sweden's had no reduction since 1990, nor Denmark, nor France. Norway's up 40%, Belgium's up 25% roughly, 15%, Ireland's up 25%. So lots of countries are emitting much more than they were in 1990. So there's failure everywhere here. So what does the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's the main body of the UN that brings together the science every few years. What do they say about climate change? And it's split into 3 working groups, and the first one is all about the science. So I'm quite unfairly here taking this huge report on science and bringing it down to one sentence, which is, I mean, it's not completely fair. But from a mitigation point of view, the most important thing is it's carbon budgets that matter, the total amount of carbon dioxide that we emit. So it's when we have the lights on in here today, the gas-fired power that will be used partly to keep these on, and probably a little bit of coal maybe, that carbon dioxide will be changing the climate for the next 100 years, and probably 20% of that carbon dioxide for the next 10,000 years. So tonight's lecture is changing the climate for the next thousands of years. So it's the budgets, the total amount of CO2 that matters, because the carbon dioxide just remains, most of it remains there, a large part of it, year after year. So if we take the IPCC report, and I'm going to just pull some really sort of simple summaries out of this, which you can ask me about. It's a paper that's actually hopefully going to be published in the next 2 months, actually, that discusses some of this. And if we're to deliver on our Paris commitment, so it's a low chance of 1.5 and a reasonable chance of 2 degrees centigrade, then we've got something like 650 billion tons of carbon dioxide that we can emit into the atmosphere. Now, unless you're a climate sort of geek type, you're not going to know much, that won't mean much to you, I think. But we currently emit about 37 billion tons from energy emissions. So a bit of maths, and that tells you we've got about 18 years of current emissions. 18 years of current emissions at a global level, and we blow through our Paris commitments. And remember, I'll show you in a minute, emissions are not going down globally, they're still going up. So where do we go to from here? Well, the first thing we need to have is a bit of humility of our starting point. So I always sort of say, before we think about what we're going to do, is we need to sort of stop and reflect for like 2 minutes about where we are, and that's quite depressing, and then put our heads up, put our shoulders back and get on and do something about it. But a bit of humility to start with. This is the first report from the IPCC in 1990. Now, often when I'm talking to students, I point out that this is before their parents met. That's not true with some of you here tonight. Or me, indeed. So 1990 might feel quite recent to us, but for a lot of people, it feels like a long, long time ago. 30 years, almost 3 decades we've known about this. And yet in 2018, the emissions were 67% higher than they were in 1990. So we've had all the information at our fingertips since 1990, if not before. And yet emissions were 67% higher. And in 2018, they still went up by about 1.6%. So we're on a rising trajectory of emissions. We had a very short gap where they stopped going up for about 2 years. So emissions are continuing to rise. So we've had 29 years of abject failure on climate change. That doesn't mean to say some people haven't tried, they have. But we have to admit that collectively we have fundamentally failed as bad as you could almost possibly imagine on this subject for 30 years. And you can see why the next generation are a little bit annoyed at my generation. And we've had a whole series of technocratic fraud. And I don't think that's too strong a language. I think that's what we've had. I think it's what they are. We've had things like partial accounting. Let's write a nice story about how well we're doing, but let's ignore aviation and shipping because they're too difficult to deal with. But they have obviously big impacts on climate change. Let's not make the reductions ourselves. Let's get the poor people to make reductions elsewhere in the world. We'll pay the Ghanaians or the Nigerians to make the reductions. We won't make them over here in the rich countries. Offsetting. That's what a lot of people use. A lot of the climate scientists still use that when they fly around the world. They offset. It's like trying to lose weight by asking someone else to cut back on the chocolate. It's not going to work as a dietary technique. So, I mean, I would actually go further, and I wrote a paper on this in Nature in 2009, I think. Might be in 2012, I can't remember. 2012. And saying that I think if you look at it from a systems point of view, offsetting is worse than doing nothing in terms of emissions. The projects might be good projects. They might be really worth pursuing. But from an overall emissions point of view, I think it actually makes the emissions higher, not lower. The clean development mechanism. We love this sort of thing. You take something that's really dodgy, and then you give it a nice name and give it an acronym, and it suddenly sounds official. Sounds like, oh, we can do that. It's worthwhile. The clean development mechanism. It's state-sanctioned offsetting. So rich countries can just say to poor countries, we'll pay you a few dollars. You make the changes, and we'll carry on as we were before. Which is what the UK government, not with the advice of the Climate Change Committee, I hasten to add, the UK government has in part of its plan is to offset its emissions by paying poor countries elsewhere, partly. Afforestation, already assumed to work in Sweden, where they are expanding their airport, Arlanda, Stockholm Airport, because they're going to plant more trees north of Sweden to compensate for that. Again, when you play that out, that probably does not work, and for lots of reasons. And I won't get into that today, but there were lots of problems with afforestation, for foresting areas that weren't previously forested, or not for a long time, because of the way that it affects the soil. Soils are a huge sort of issue, a lot of uncertainty, and a big problem, I think, in terms of climate change emissions. When all of this lot fails, which it has been, we're going to rely, and I'll come back to this in a bit more detail, on negative emission technologies. And I cannot overplay how important these are. Virtually every single scenario about what we have to do about climate change has these in there at a scale that is not that dissimilar to the current fossil fuel industry. It's like a new industry in the future that doesn't exist that's going to suck our carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And our children are going to have to put this in place, not us, our children. That's in virtually every single run, and it's absolutely essential to the Committee on Climate Change's advice to the UK government. I'll come back to that later. And when that one fails, because most of the people you talk to in the models say we don't think we'll be able to deliver the level we have in the models, we're already planning on geoengineering. Firing rockets into the stratosphere to spread out sulfate particles in the right higher part of the atmosphere that reflect sunlight into space, because we can't be bothered to make the changes today. And we'd have to do that repeatedly because the particles migrate out to the poles. So geoengineering. What we haven't tried in 29 years is to cut our carbon dioxide emissions. So you think, oh, we've tried everything else but cutting our CO2 emissions. And that's everywhere. I mean, that's for many of us. It's for our universities, it's for our towns, it's for our cities, it's for our countries. I mean, this is across the board. None of us have tried to reduce our emissions, with the odd exception. So it's failure writ large. At every single level, we have fundamentally failed. So that's quite depressing. So let's look for some good news. Now, some of you might have heard this man, Leonard Cohen. It has to be, for those of you who do know Leonard Cohen, he's not normally someone you would go to listen to for good news. I actually love Leonard Cohen. He's more of a poet than a singer, but some of you might have come across him. For the younger generation, he unfortunately is dead now, but well worth getting his music out, I think. He only died a couple of years ago. So I'm using a quote from his quite famous song, Anthem. Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering, there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. And I think it captures lots of things in life, but I think it captures climate change quite well. So, ring the bells that still can ring. What we are not waiting for is wonderful inventions from scientists and engineers. As an engineer, I like inventing things, but we're not waiting for them. We know what to do today. So whether it's making sure our houses are built so they don't use energy to keep them warm. We have these ones, passive house standards. They're easy to, we've been building them for the last 20 plus years. We know how to do it. It doesn't cost us much more money. Why make all of our cars so they have a maximum emission standard? We don't have that. We just have something called a fleet average. But we could make that really tight to make sure all of our cars were very low emission and got tighter every year. We know we have to eat less meat, particularly red meat, ruminants. Any animal with 2 stomachs is a problem. It puts out a lot of methane. So we don't all have to become vegan or vegetarian. That might help, but actually certainly eating less red meat would be good. No airport expansion. Retrofit all our existing buildings. British people live in terrible quality buildings. I was joking to them in Sweden that a Swedish tent is about as efficient as a British house. And when I go to Ireland, I realise that a British tent is about as efficient as an Irish house. I spent quite a bit of time in Ireland, so you realise how bad they are. So we know what to do. We're not short of things to do, and there's many more than this. So let's ring these bells. Let's get on doing these things today. And let's forget the perfect offerings we hear, the perfect offerings that come from the professionalisation of climate change. So we've got the Stern report, which a lot of people think is really wonderful, but the numbers are really dodgy in it. I mean, emissions data is just simply wrong by an order of magnitude. So as with most economists, they should be forced to only really deal with page numbers, not with real numbers. But he was very brave in asking questions about the concept of discounting. So in that sense, I think it's a really important report. But the academics remained quiet, despite the fact the actual information in it was factually wrong by a very significant margin on the emissions data, and therefore his conclusions. We've got the IPCC, but they're the third working group, which focuses on reducing emissions, on mitigation. And all of their, virtually every single scenario, other than maybe 2 of them, assume massive levels of this negative emission technologies in the future. So that's very dangerous. So that report is saying, leave it to the next generation. We've got the new climate economy, partly a sort of throwback to some of Stern's work, which is basically, we can have a greened economic growth. So it's greenwashing the current system. And then we've got the Committee on Climate Change's report. And what all of these smack of to me, and I think this is really worrying, this is 2019, and they are still deeply embedded in colonialism. We are saying in this, and I'll come back a little bit to this sort of metaphor later, that we want a much larger slice of the carbon pie than would really be the appropriate fare level for the UK. So we're asking for a much bigger slice. So I would sort of jokingly say, but it's not really joking, we stole the slaves of the poor people, we stole their minerals, and now we're stealing their carbon budget. This is colonialism, just carrying on today. Just because they're nice, well-meaning people doesn't mean we're still wrapping ourselves in a colonial response to climate change. The poor will have to suffer the crumbs that we leave them. It's even worse than that. We then pass the challenge on to our children. So we'll have a much larger part of the budget, and then our children have to respond to it. We're not going to do it, not my generation. We want to carry on as we are. So what we've got is a whole greenwash business as usual. That was probably fine in 2000 and 1990, but in 2019, there was almost no carbon budget left. It's a much more challenging situation now than we faced before. So, and I'm going to come back again a bit more to the carbon budget framing for the UK later. So how loud must the Paris bells ring? How loud have we got to ring these things? How important, how rapid and things? I should add, this is where my family come from, on my dad's family. This is the Isle of Arran on the west coast of Scotland, where my uncle was a crofter up here. So it's where I'm going to go when we have climate change. The most beautiful part of the world, but I'm probably biased.
How many metres above sea level?
Well, his place is probably okay. yeah, the coast would change, yeah. I saw some pictures the other day for Vietnam, because one of my relatives is from Vietnam, and it's really worrying. You look at, she was really almost in tears when she was looking at some of the estimates for Vietnam. You know, this is a real issue that some parts of the world, they're going to they're going to completely change the landscape of their countries where people are living. So this is our emissions historically. This is out to 2100 now, emissions of carbon dioxide. And before Paris, we were heading up here somewhere, 4 to 6 degrees centigrade of warming. We don't know quite where that was because the science, like all good science, has quite a lot of uncertainty in it. So we're not sure exactly where we were heading. And the one thing I will add now is that there is no such thing, hopefully there's no climate skeptics here, but there's no such thing as climate science. There never has been anything such thing as climate science. It's just science. So it's just physics and chemistry and biology. It's the same science that keeps the planes in the air, the cars working, our phones operating, our heating system working, the lights on. It's the same science. So there isn't a special thing called climate science. And so if you don't really think you don't think what we're judging for climate is right, then broadly we're saying we don't really follow science. So what I'm saying is that this is our estimates from the science. It's not a special form of science. So we were heading somewhere like this. With the Paris Agreement, every country in the world, pretty much every single country, said what it would do. What can we do? What's the most that we can imagine achieving? And then you add all those promises and pledges together, and you're looking to 3 to 4 degrees centigrade of warming across the century. Now that's like a different planet. That's not the same place that we live now. I mean, that would be fine if it occurred over thousands and thousands of years, but not if it occurs overnight, in 100 years, which is just overnight. And yet in Paris, we've promised for 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. And remember, this is a low chance of 1.5, almost no chance, I would say, of that sort of reduction. Now, that's zero carbon energy by 2050. And I can give you some of the numbers behind that if you want to ask me later. Zero carbon energy. But remember what we said before. We've signed up. I know we're not taking it seriously, but I'm assuming we are. We've signed up on the basis of equity, which means the rich countries have to be way ahead of that. So we've signed every single agreement that we make. I'm sure it'll be the same this year. We say that the rich countries should show some leadership on this. So this framing of climate change is very different to that sort of euphoria, where what we see are high-emitting people saying how wonderful we're doing. And you hear this all the time, this sort of optimistic nonsense about climate change. So why is it that what I'm saying looks so different to the sort of enthusiasm we see from these people? And it's because the policymakers have received a very, very different story, and they've also wanted to receive a different story. Their advice has been dominated by a particular type of modelling group. These aren't climate modelling groups. There's a climate dimension, quite a simple climate model. It's then allied with a particular type of economic model. It's broadly a neoclassical growth model, if that means anything to you. General equilibrium model, if anyone. Anyway, so it's an economic model based on markets. But there's a bit more to it than that, but broadly that. And then there's some work on sort of like transitions about how fast can you move between technologies. So there's estimates of that. And all of this is put together in these huge models. And when they run these about what should we do about climate change, they come up with much larger carbon budgets with much less challenging mitigation. So if you plotted that out on here, you can say the modelled emissions, the average of the modelled emissions from these big modelling groups. Remember, these modelling groups are only in the wealthy countries. No poor country does these modelling groups, does this modelling. Just wealthy parts of the world, small groups of people, primarily men, in certain parts of the world. So that has to ask you something about who are the people that write the models. And the results look like that. So which would you prefer? If you're a policymaker trying to sell a policy, or if you're a vice chancellor trying to grow your university, or you're a councillor trying to grow your town, which one do you prefer, the red one or the blue one? If you're going to go on a holiday somewhere, which one would you prefer if you're going to fly somewhere? The blue one becomes very difficult. And the reason there's a difference between them, is what I'm going to come back to in a minute, is because of these negative emissions. So what we get is, since Paris, we see the science broadly saying it's about 650 billion tons of CO2 we can dump in the atmosphere for 2 degrees C-ish. And we've got the economic modelers, primarily economic modelers, saying we've got about 1,500 billion tons. So how come we've got these two completely different numbers out of the same science? So how do we make sense? This is some of you might recognize this is from Dr. Strangelove. Yeah. It's one of my favorite climate change films. It's about a certain type of men and certain types of technologies. It tells you a lot about how we're responding to climate change, or why we're not responding to it. But that, and there's another excellent film called Merchant of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. Those two films, that one is actually about climate change. They're both really good to give you a feeling of where we are today. So how can we make sense of this huge difference? And this is going to sound quite flippant from an academic, but it's actually that we are pulling rabbits from hats. The academic community has been doing this and staying quiet about it for about almost 20 years now. Maybe 15 years, really, at significant level. So we've conjured up, and that's the right expression, these negative emission technologies, NETs. They've got all sorts of acronyms, which again makes them sound like you can go out and buy them in the shops in the shelves in Tesco's. These things don't exist. There are a few very, very small pilot schemes, and otherwise they're in the imaginations of postdocs and perhaps professors as well. So they're not out there, but we are assuming in almost all of the models that these will work in the future. They're going to suck our children, and our children's children, we'll have to suck hundreds of billions of tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. As I said, it's assuming an industry not that dissimilar to the current fossil fuel industry. And that's the negative emissions going out here. Notice it goes out to 2100. But look, when do you think the people who write in the models will retire or die? About here somewhere. So the modelers don't have to worry about this because they won't be here. They'll either be living in Tuscany or pushing up the daisies. But their children and their children's children will be doing it out to here, and it goes on beyond that. It goes way beyond the end of the century. So all the models, almost every single model runs like this. This is just the median value from the IPCC scenarios. So if you take away, and that's the work that I've been doing or I should say that I think we should research those things. I think we have to research those technologies, and we have to research even geoengineering, but we should assume that they do not work. So we should reduce emissions as if they don't work, but let's research them. But let's imagine now that they don't work. We don't pass the buck on to our children. We actually start to act appropriately. What would the UK's fair contribution to Paris be? And here it's all about pies. So, and if you're from Manchester, we like pies or tarts. I've got to be careful how you say that, but anyway. So to limit to 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade of warming, we have a certain amount of carbon we can emit, a carbon pie. Now, it could be a bit bigger than this, if we're lucky on the science. It could be a bit smaller. And I think we'll find in the next major set of reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it is likely to be smaller and perhaps a lot smaller. The signs are not good from the new model runs. These are the climate model, not the economic ones. The new climate runs that are coming out from what are called the Earth system models, the initial runs look really quite worrying, that we think that the levels of feedbacks are such that the budgets might be much, much smaller. Let's hope they're wrong, but the early signs from quite a few of the ones now are not looking good. So let's just stick at the moment with this number, which comes out the latest set of reports from the IPCC. For those that want to know, it's SR 1.5. This is the headline budget for a 66 to 100% chance of 2 degrees centigrade and a 33% chance or lower of 1.5. So about 650 billion tons. This is for energy. We've got to split that amongst every country in the world, and that starts, and you think, oh, that's going to be a bit difficult. You've got this global budget. Every country's got to say, well, what would its fair share be? And the problem is that everyone's negotiators go there, and before they leave, their sort of leader says, get as much as you can. So it's not a really good process. Now, there are ways you can deal with that. You could ask everyone to negotiate for another country. So if you can ask the EU negotiators to negotiate for Nigeria, the Nigerian one for the US for China, China for Ghana. So that way, what happens if you look at that from this quite interesting sort of mixture of sort of game theory and philosophy that tell you that you'll get a much fairer distribution than if you ask everyone to negotiate for themselves. So there are ways around this, and we will have to find a way around it. There isn't some neat way out of this. The science requires us to live within this budget. It is a rationing issue in one way or another. So the question we've asked is, what is a fair share for the wealthy parts of the world? And this is not to scale, it's just I could find a pie with a slice out of it. It's probably not far off scale, actually. We haven't used the OECD, there's a lot more to it than that, but broadly the wealthy parts of the world are there. And it could be bigger than that, it could be smaller. Do you divide the pie up on the basis of population, on your historical emissions, your current emissions, the size of your GDP? All these things mean you get a bigger or smaller slice, and we've done that for a range of these criteria. And then of that slice of pie, we asked how much did the UK get? Again, we've done that on the basis of a number of criteria. And what we get for the UK is that we can emit between 3 to 3.8 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which I hasten to add is about a half to a third of what the Committee on Climate Change are assuming, because they're assuming that the poor countries should have much less, which we think is a little bit unfair. Now, that probably means very little to most of you here. That's 9 years of current emissions. 9 years. And we'd have blown through all of that budget. So let's try and translate that into what we have to do year on year. We've done a lot of this work now. With that budget, we've also split it down now to some regions. So we've done quite a lot of the local authorities and councils in the UK. We've done more with the Scottish Government. In Sweden, we've done half of the local authorities in Sweden now, worked out what their carbon budget would be, just to help them think about what they'd need to do. But then you also say, well, what's the reduction rate every single year? And it's about 10 to 13% every year, as an average for richer countries. Now, just think what that means. That's about a 30% reduction in the next 3 years. Think about your own lives, or if you're in an institution, 30% reduction in 3 years. You're not going to bring that about through technology. You can only bring that about through changes in behavior over that period. By 2030, you have a 70% reduction. Now, then you can start to think, well, technology will be helping us. And by 2035 to 40, zero carbon energy. That's everything. Planes, trains, ships, refrigerators, industry, everything. Not low carbon, zero carbon. And the reason it has to be zero is because you're going to get some ongoing emissions from agriculture, which will have to have some way of compensating for that warming. So this is a completely different agenda to the one we hear normally. It's exactly the same numbers, same science. Sorry, not the same numbers. Same science, and just some maths, some arithmetic, but no negative emission technologies and equity brought in there. This is immediate and profound system change. This is completely different to the world that we have normalized. So the question I then asked myself, coming back from Bonn, from one of the negotiations a few years ago, which is, I was really quite depressed on the train going back up to Sweden. And I thought, well, are there any signs that there's going to be some big system changes? I mean, it's hard to see them on a day-to-day basis, but I started to think about it. I think there are some. But initially I was thinking, whether you're a policymaker or a scientist or the journalist, academics, the whole lot, we're all going to hell in a handcart. There was almost nothing, as I was going out from Bonn, it's just really depressing. When I got to Denmark, I felt a bit more uplifted. But there's nothing really good out there. And I started to think about, this is sort of quite a famous painting of going to hell in a handcart. And you can probably imagine which heads you'd like to see in there. We may disagree about them, but anyway. But I was starting to think, is there any, if that's so depressing, I might as well just pack up. But is there any light in this despair? Back to Leonard Cohen, always uplifting. So is there a crack there? So I started to think with the fabrics and the cracks in the fabric. Now, I'm not saying these are good or bad. All I'm saying are these are fairly fundamental cracks in the system. The banking crisis. If you'd gone back to 2006 and said we'd like the Chancellor of the Exchequer to write a cheque next year for £500 billion, you'd have been laughed at. No one would have thought it was possible. And yet virtually every country in the world wrote these huge cheques. Now, okay, in the Western world, we just chose to give them to the bankers, which was probably a big mistake. We could have chosen that to put that into greening our infrastructure, to making our houses better quality for people to live in, so we didn't have people in fuel poverty and children with bronchial problems. We could have put that into a public transport infrastructure. Instead, we gave it to the bankers. But you didn't have to. Social media. I mean, if you went back 10 years, no one would think social media like it is now. If you go back to 1990, the IPCC report, I mean, I don't think any of us would even know what social media was. So it's a fundamental shift in the ways that we engage on issues. I personally am really in favour of this, even though there are massive problems with it. But I think there are lots of problems with the old system where we were discussing with some of the students earlier, actually, in my view, that what we've had in somewhere like Britain is 100 to 150 years of the papers owned by a few rich white men who live in the countryside. And that's all we've been fed for 100 plus years. So we've normalised that sort of adjusted media for all of our lives, and almost all of our parents' lives. And social media, now you sort of jokingly say, we used to have 4 people own the papers, now we've got 60 million nutters sending a tweet every day. Now, given the choice, I would prefer the tweets. It does require us to be discerning users of the media. We've got to think about what we're looking at. Where does it come from? How robust is it? Are there some links to go and check things out? So we have a job to do in understanding it, but at least it's much more open. All sorts of people can engage in it. It's not just a certain group of people. So I think social media is a wonderful thing with some really black, dark sides to it. Brexit and Trump, who would have imagined that? Just a few years ago, you couldn't possibly imagine that the US would be run by an orange gentleman and that we'd be coming out of the EU. Now, whatever we might think about either of those things, you couldn't have imagined that a few years ago. The Arab Spring, I was talking about with two people here doing their PhDs from some countries that were affected by the Arab Spring. Again, I don't think people could have envisaged why that would come out and where it would appear from. And there was some discussion earlier about perhaps the issues to do with access to resources and the limitations of resources were one of the factors in here. But but you wouldn't have imagined that in advance. The plummeting price of renewables, even talk to people who work in this area, they didn't think renewables would come down like they are doing now. They're still coming down. The latest round of offshore wind turbines, these are not, these are private companies doing this, about half the price of the last large round of offshore wind turbines. So the prices are still coming down to levels that make it very difficult to know what you should invest in. It's much cheaper to build renewables now than it is to build any of the fossil fuel options, even gas. But the problem still, there are some other issues about how you fit it into the system, but the prices are really coming down, even when you take into account some of the storage issues. And then even organizations like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, it's not really a left-wing think tank, it's fairly conservative, pointing out the huge health impacts of fossil fuels or the huge subsidies going to that sector, about 5 trillion a year. So there are big changes occurring. And what I wanted to think about was, are they big enough to, could you imagine them coming together in some way and aligning to mean a huge global system change? And I think perhaps you might be able to see that. So there are some cracks out there. And the question I was asking myself was, is there any light coming through? And actually when I was coming back from Bonn, I couldn't see much light. And where would you look for light? I certainly wouldn't have looked for it as she was then, 15-year-old Swedish schoolgirl. But Greta Thunberg has had an amazing impact. So the school strikes or Extinction Rebellion. Now, we can all argue about one thing or that about whether we like this or that about them. There's certainly big problems with them, but there are also many wonderful things about them. Or the idea of flying shame. Or actually, I think if you look at the Swedish, I think it's more like flying conscience, which I think is a much better way of looking at it. But what's important is that if you went back 18 months, you wouldn't imagine any of these things happening. These are a complete sea change. And what's also interesting, they've produced more engagement on the issues of climate change at a sort of establishment level across virtually every country of the world, or at least many countries of the world, I should say, not every, but many countries of the world, than people like I have done or the NGOs have done for 30 years. So we have to look at these people, and okay, maybe they've built other people's work, but I think their contribution has been absolutely phenomenal, and we should be working with them to now this new way that we can open up. We've opened up dialogues. Sorry, they've opened up dialogues. They've opened up new ways to discuss the issues that simply were not there before. So, what is real action to deliver on Paris? Do any of you remember these days? Probably not. But this is just near here, I gather. What do we need to do? I always get told if you use an equation, you lose half of the audience. But anyway, it's an equation. It's quite a simple one. And it's a maths equation. You can argue it's a moral equation. If you're a philosopher, you could think of it like this, depending on your form of philosophy. But Paris plus IPCC, it should say Working Group 1, Paris plus the science equals equity. And I think you just can conclude that from the maths now. So the CO2 emissions, you can see why we're not solving climate change now, this next set of slides, are massively skewed towards a few people. So these are the emissions at the global level. This is based on an infographic that was developed using the work from Chancellor and Piketty from 2015. And it's been shown repeatedly to be very similar. Most of the emissions come from a very small percentage of the population. You cannot squeeze emissions out of these people. The poor people of the world, and that includes a lot of people in countries like the UK and the US. These people cannot change what they do. They're stuck in the system, and they hardly emit anyway. Most of the emissions come from this group. This group out here, which includes people like me and people who say, well, I can't change because of the system. We've got massive opportunity for change. We just choose not to. Now, with some Swedish colleagues, we're trying to look at now, can we plot this for different countries? We think the UK and the US are very similar to the global level because of the massive inequality. If you're Sweden, it will probably come into a slightly wider base. So if you're more egalitarian, you won't see it coming quite as thin, a bit thicker. 50% of global carbon dioxide from 10% of the global population, 70% from 20% of the population. And I bet if you took this group here and looked at your emissions over the last year or the last 5 years, you'd find that Pareto's rule holds. Very approximately, 80% of the emissions coming from this group here will come from just 20% of the people in the room. So if you look at the person next to you, that'd be the high emitter. This occurs everywhere you go. So does this really matter? Because often the question you get, well, it doesn't really matter about the wealthy people emitting a bit. When they were wealthy, I mean, including professors and lots of people who don't like to think ourselves as wealthy, but we clearly are. A quick thought experiment. Just imagine that we thought climate change was a serious issue. I know, a bizarre idea, but let's imagine we did. And that we then had regulations that required the top 10% in whatever way it would work to cut their carbon dioxide emissions down to the level of the average European EU citizen. So it's not the average poor person, the average EU citizen. They're fairly wealthy, live fairly good lives in the EU. And the other 90% of the world's population made no change to what they're doing today. If anyone's seen me do this before, you know the answer. You have any idea would there be a reduction in emissions of just 10% of the population changing their behavior? Would that make a big difference? A 1/3 cut in global CO2. Now, that's the other 90% doing nothing. That's not going to solve climate change. But remember, the Paris Agreement has all those pledges put together, which mean no change by 2030. If we thought this was a climate emergency, as our parliament has declared, you could do that in a year, a month, probably a week, if you really thought it was that important. And we know who that 10% are. We generally see them when we put our makeup on or have a shave. Staring back from the mirror. And I would say, if you look at this, this leads us to an unavoidable strategy to deliver on Paris, almost across every country, pretty much every country. It doesn't tell us what the policies look like. The policies will be culturally and geographically and economically specific to different parts of the world. Even in the UK, you do something different in Scotland to what you do in England. And you certainly different things in Sweden, and China would do things very differently. But the strategy, the three-phase, looks the same. The first thing you've got to do is you've got to make massive reductions in the near term. And you can't do that with technology. You can't change the public transport system. You can't change the houses people live in. You can't change the electricity generation in 2-3 years. What you can change are the emissions from the high emitters. And so you have to have profound changes in the behaviors and practices of that group. There's no choice about that. You fail on Paris if you don't deliver it, because so much of the emissions have to be brought out of the system almost immediately. In the near term, you need to make sure that everything that we use is highly energy efficient, and that any money we save is not spent on a jet ski or another holiday. So the rebound effect. And then when I say efficient, I mean, if you look at an A-rated refrigerator, it uses about 60 to 80% more energy than an A+++ refrigerator. So you're talking about having standards where the financial directors of the companies will squeal, but the engineers will just deliver it. So whether it's refrigerators, cars, everything that we have, as efficient as possible. But we also, of course, need to start putting in place a complete shift in our energy system away from fossil fuels. 81% fossil fuel at the moment. And that's like a Marshall-style, for any of them, probably none of us can remember that, but anyway. That was the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War, that sort of Marshall Plan. There are lots of problems with the Marshall Plan from a political point of view, but it's the physical reconstruction. That's the scale of challenge we're looking at. And also worth bearing in mind, we need massive electrification. Only 20% of the energy we consume in most rich countries is electricity. 80% of it is not electricity. And if we're going to be decarbonised, most of that system has to become electric, probably 80% or more. So the thing about this, these are the sort of strategies. It doesn't tell you what the policies are. And this is the bit that sounds like it's socialism or communism or something, but it's just maths. At the moment, the labour and the resources that furnish the relative luxuries of this particular group up here, those labour and resources are going to be required to make this huge shift in our infrastructure. You know, to retrofit 25 million homes in the UK, to make sure that we have an electrical system that's 2 to 5 times bigger than it currently is. That our transport system is made electrified, that we have much more public transport, all in about 20 years. And so in the interim, you cannot have these people using the labour and the resources. You can go back to the inequality afterwards, if you want to. But in the interim, it raises fundamental questions about our society. And you sort of feel what that looks like. I mean, these are not small changes, because we chose to fail till now. We should not be living in large houses. They should really be split up to make more appropriate size homes. Because remember, at the moment, we're trying to build lots more houses. Every time you build a house, that's lots more carbon, lots more materials, and lots more labour. We already have lots of houses. I cycle past them in Cheshire, huge mansions where vice chancellors and other people live. Yeah, they should be split so that 3 families live there. They better still be pretty good houses. No more holiday homes, second homes, no more big prestige cars, no SUV vehicles. Remember, SUV vehicles are one of the main reasons that we're seeing a big rise in car emissions around the globe at the moment. They're completely outselling electrical vehicles. No multiple car ownership, no highly mobile lives, no academics flying around all over the world to tell the little people about what they should do about climate change. No frequent flyers, no business or first class flights. These ones cause about 2 to 3 times the amount of emissions of a normal flight. No high level of consumer goods by the wealthy, by people like me. Because all of those labour and resources are required for this shift in infrastructure. We are going to require a whole set of new narratives about talking about the world in which we live. We're going to have to rethink, what does growth mean? What does progress mean? What does development mean? We're going to have to think about, how do we reward people? What's important? What are the things that we value in the world? If you're successful at the moment, what do? When you think about it, we just pay them more so the carbon footprint goes up. You think about in a university, what are universities for? People come here because they have a nice time, they learn to get a good education. But they also come here to get the education so they can get a better job. A better job. What does it mean by a better job? A higher paying job. Why do you want a higher paying job? So you can have a bigger house, bigger car, fly more, buy more stuff, have a bigger carbon footprint. Our whole system is set up to maximize our carbon footprint. We're going to have to start to restructure that. You know who has the big carbon footprints in our universities? It's the wealthy ones. It's the professors, it's the vice chancellors, it's the deans. These are the ones with the big carbon footprints. So we've rewarded success by passing that on. We're going to have to rethink that. We're going to need a completely different relationship with time. We don't care about the future anymore. We don't really think about the past. We need to reopen that, like some cultures have done, where they think about 7 generations before and 7 generations in the future. So we need to re-establish a different relationship with time. We need to embed intra- and intergenerational equity. We should genuinely care about people elsewhere. We should also care about our own children's future, neither of which we seem to be at the moment. And we must also have a much deeper appreciation of the more than human world, of which we are, of course, part. We're not separate. Despite the fact post-Enlightenment we've tried to separate ourselves from the rest of the world, we are part of the ecosystem of the planet. And we are doing a pretty good job of destroying it, but we're part of that. We must start to understand that wider sort of way of looking at the world. So to conclude, climate change has become system change. And it has become system change because we have chosen to fail for 30 years. So we have just this whisper of carbon budget left. As Einstein noted, he may not have noted this, but it's attributed to him, but we're very uncertain where it comes from. But it's a good quote all the same. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And thus far, we have chosen to pass on to our children the consequences of 30 years of such insanity. We have failed doing the same thing over and over and over again for 30 years. And we're going to have to start to think fundamentally different about the future. But thankfully, things are changing in 2019, I think. There's some positive signs. I'm not an optimist. I'm also not a pessimist. I'm a sort of realist. And I think what you can see are some chinks in the armor, some light coming through. So go back to Leonard Cohen. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. Now, before I go into closing, hang on. What I will do very quickly. What can we do? I got asked this earlier. What can we do? And there are 3 things that I think we can do about this as citizens, if we think it's important. 1, we should identify our own big carbon footprints and try and change them. But it doesn't really matter about the emissions. We should try and change them. What matters is that we try. We find out what's easy, what's difficult. But most importantly, we then talk about it with our friends, our family, our children, our parents, our grandparents, our neighbours. So we start a dialogue about what it is you have to do and how difficult and how easy it is to make some big changes in our lives. But we also then need to engage in our place of work or study. It could be a university, a hospital, a school, in a company, wherever that might be. Engage in the company and engage constructively. Argue, try and identify the things that we can do. Give praise to people that are doing good things and then criticize them when they're doing things that are not aligned. And if you have problems doing that as individuals, try and do it collectively with other people. But also engage nationally. Engage with our MPs and our ministers about our concerns. Criticize them or critique them when their actions don't meet their promises and their commitments. But also, if they do things that are good, praise them. Say, well done, that's a really important change. So do both of those things. Always do this courteously, constructively, and firmly. But at 3 levels here, we should, as individuals, be engaging. So on that note, if it goes back, thank you for listening.